these factories will not be able to compete unless they move towards greater and greater automation. So, and then you think about it, you start looking at all the jobs that are currently out there. And if we think about the robots and the AIs, how many are likely to feel this competitive pressure? Almost all of them. Mm-hmm. Almost all of them. So to say 25% is absurd. The only thing I think that's slowing down this transition is because AI capabilities, they're still very narrow in their intelligence. They're not generalized, right? So they have difficulty moving from STEM, as we talked about, to other fields. But as we get closer and closer to artificial general intelligence, and their intelligence becomes more and more general, meaning they're having PhD capability in even more domains, you're going to start to see them move more and more to white collar work. And as the AIs start to get, there's a big manufacturing challenge right now with robots, right? But as the AIs, more and more AIs get released into the world and they start learning from interacting with the environment, again, like children, they're going to get better at navigating this environment. We're already seeing like Teslas and autopilot, right? Capable of amazing things. And so really we just have this manufacturing bottleneck. The AI will be there in the next year or two. They'll be fairly generalized, I think, to be able to work in most environments. You're going to see those robots just flood the market. So, I think realistically in the horizon of 10 years, you could look at 80 and 90% of GDP economy jobs just being gone.
Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning.
So today, what I want to do in this conversation with you is break down for our audience what AI is, what artificial intelligence is, to start to unpack that and to understand then what Catholic AI is and why it's important and the mission, of course, of Magisterium AI and everything that we're doing at Longbeard.
Cool, shoot.
So Matthew, let's start from the very beginning then. What is artificial intelligence? This is something that, of course, is the buzzword of this summer of our time. There feels like there's not a single technology company that's not working on AI as we speak. What is it?
So there's a bunch of ways to define what AI is. The definition that I find the most kind of useful is think of it as kind of humanity's quest to replicate the ability to think, learn, and know in machines. Essentially, thinking machines is essentially what we're trying to create with artificial intelligence.
And in terms of thinking, like thinking has many components. There's the reflective aspect of it. There's the critical analytical, response to it. There's, in some sense, there's that self-awareness or that self-reflection. Are machines doing that, or are they simulating or mimicking the act of thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's pretty. There's a lot of debate around this. I wouldn't say that machines are thinking in the same way we are. Certainly, I would say that they have the ability to perform certain kind of reasoning functions. In a sense, they're able to take like a large trough of data, and if you ask it to query it, they're able to kind of distill it. So, and we do this, obviously, human beings do this as well. I think they also have the ability that we're seeing more and more that they have the ability to kind of reflect, and they have this ability to kind of think in the kind of conceptual space. Now, this is something kind of like new, because when they first came out, I think we just kind of, thought of them as we say, as stochastic parrots, basically, where they're just kind of parroting. We train them on next token prediction, which, basically the way a large language model works. This might be helpful for kind of illustrating the point. Is essentially when you submit a prompt, the AI is basically taking that prompt and it's predicting what token should follow after your prompt, right? And a token is like a subword unit. And so it basically kind of calculates a distribution of what should be the probable next token, basically off all probable words. It runs the numbers, and then it basically predicts what it thinks should be the next token, and it predicts that token. And then it basically feeds that token back into the input, along with the prompt and the previous token, and then it runs it again, right? And then it does it again. And that's basically when you see it kind of generate word to word, that's essentially what it's doing. So, and for a long time, we thought that's all it was doing. It was just simply calculating, probabilities based on the distribution of all possible words. But we're starting to realize now, as these models get more intelligent, and I say that in quotation marks, there's more going on there. That they're not just doing next token prediction. That there is some kind of when we train these things, kind of we call it the pre-training phase. We basically give them access to a whole troves of data, and they basically just they crunch it, so to speak. They do develop some conceptual understanding of the way the world kind of works based upon the data that they have access to. So. And so they do kind of think and reason in a conceptual space or like a latent space, like we do. So this is pretty interesting, right? So this is something beyond just next token prediction that's happening here. They're able to actually think ahead to some extent. And this is really just more cutting edge research coming out of Anthropic, which is they're finally being able to kind of prove this. So certainly, what they're doing is not what we're doing, but it's similar. So it's kind of like an alien intelligence. And if you look into groups like Anthropic and the research they're doing on mechanistic interpretability, it's fascinating. You can kind of see how they think, like even how they approach a math problem, right? It's pretty interesting. They kind of have parallel approaches where they may take a quick pass at it and kind of arrive at what they kind of think is probably the right answer. And then they'll actually kind of also go through and do it kind of very meticulously, kind of work through the actual math, right? And they kind of see if that initial kind of run at it, which arrived at an answer after having kind of, done a little bit more of kind of a detailed, thought processes arriving. Do they arrive at the same answer, right? So this is pretty interesting, right? I mean, I don't think that we I suppose in some ways you could say that we do this. I mean, if someone asks us math questions, we may kind of instinctively have an idea of what the answer should be, but we still have to kind of, do the math in our head to arrive there. So in some ways that what they're doing is the same, but just seeing how they actually arrive there is very different. So
and Matthew, is this ability for them to arrive at certain answers like this, is it very is it well structured and successful at certain types of problems, but maybe less successful at others? Like, for example, mathematics or something that have, I don't want to say simple, but a definable language, a definable mode of expression versus something like a creative field or something like that, which might, require certain aspects of the human experience to do very successfully.
Yeah, I mean, totally. They're certainly better. I mean, what they're good at, it comes down to what they're trained on. So the thing is with the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, they tend to excel in those fields, namely because they're kind of the verifiable domains, right? So we're able to kind of feed them problems and answers, and it's very cut and dry, right? Because they're verifiable domains, we can actually train them a large corpus of data and then feed them the problems, and then when they come up with an answer, we can verify that answer is correct. And so this is really important, especially because in the past, one of the kind of major bottlenecks on AI development is the fact that we have to kind of come up with these problems and these solutions, right? And that's very tedious because humans have to propose the question and the answer, and there's so much time and energy we have to do that. There's actually right now the problem is we fed them all the problems and the answers that we have access to, but we want them to go beyond that. And so, but essentially, if you can think about verifiable domains as being kind of that unlock which allows these AIs to become excellent in these respective fields, in the same way in the arts, in the humanities, well, those are not verifiable domains, right? There is, if you ask someone like some kind of artistic question, do you like this painting or don't you? Like, what is good about this painting? What is not? I mean, that's not like verifiable in the same way like a math problem is, right? It's much more subjective, and so they tend not to be as good in those fields. I mean, they memorize a lot of all this information is kind of compressed inside of their parameters. So they memorize what people say about these things and they can parrot those back, but they can't provide insight in the same way they can live with math problems. They can't be sure that they're right, and they can't explain how they arrive there, right? Because it's, as I said, it's a more subjective field. And so in those domains, AI progress is much slower. But I think there is, I should say, in the area of code as well. The nice thing about like math and code, they're excellent for teaching machines kind of how to think and reason, right? How to think step by step, so to speak. And the learning that they do in these kind of STEM fields, it does actually have relevance in the non-STEM fields, right? I mean, there's a lot of obviously philosophical reasoning, for instance. Philosophical reasoning is typically done in typical language, right? Yeah. Not in mathematical terms. But so what the AIs learn in math and coding, they can kind of apply semantically, right?
Philosophy.
Exactly. So it can help them with philosophical reasoning. And what we've been observing as well is it also makes them pretty good at even understanding theological reasoning. And so I think that's, so the breakthroughs they're making in STEM will have, I think, implications for many other fields, although, they're not going to have as much rapid progress in the arts and the humanities as they will in STEM.
Wow. And Matthew, in terms of reasoning, I remember hearing a number of different philosophers who were working on AI talking about, okay, well, we have carbon-based brains. So I guess it's like 3 pounds of matter. We have neural networks, and that limits our ability to reason at a certain speed. But with silicon, and the chips that AI is running, the speed is essentially light speed. There's no telling how quickly the reasoning, the developments, the advancements. How does that work in terms of training AI? I know that initially I think it was in the 1950s or 1960s when there was those students at Dartmouth who said we're going to spend a summer and see if we can resolve a machine audiovisual progress. And obviously the last I guess 70 years or so we've seen enormous progress. How quickly do you foresee the advancements in AI arriving at more creative fields or more embodied robotics that are going to start to enter into different fields that might not be seen right now?
Well, I mean, it's progress has been exceptional. I don't think any of us could have predicted how quickly we'd be progressing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it'll be long before we start seeing AI, certainly exceed the computational capabilities of the human brain. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, right now, AIs, in some ways they do already. I mean, certainly. I mean, their ability to memorize vast swaths of information and retrieve said information and spit out answers is certainly, I think, well beyond what the human brain is capable of. But that being said, that they're still not capable of the same kind of critical thinking that we are, and there's certainly that their intelligence is still fairly narrow. So, one way to think about this is as I mentioned before, in the STEM fields. Because there's a lot of commonalities between those fields, right? A lot of underlying principles which are fairly consistent. They tend to be very good, and in fact, they're benchmarking now at PhD level and beyond.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, the most recent model, the most intelligent model in the world right now is said to be kind of Grok 4, and that model has exceptional capabilities. I mean, and that certainly would have PhD capability in most domains. But that being said, just because it has PhD capability doesn't necessarily mean it's capable of the same kind of innovation that the human brain is, right? So when we say PhD capability, what it basically means is that the average state of the art model can basically answer the same kind of questions that a PhD student can answer, right? Mm-hmm. But that really means is that they're able to retain critical information and apply it in innumerable cases, kind of like a PhD could. But that doesn't mean that they're capable of the same kind of innovation or invention, right? That's a different kind of thing. Because they're trained on large swaths of data, and they're able to then identify patterns in those data, and they're able to then use those patterns to make certain kinds of inferences. But like invention and innovation is something unique, right? We have a truly original idea, and I don't think we're there. And I think most of the heads of the AI labs would acknowledge we haven't got there yet. Like these models are not capable of true invention. So I think we still have that edge, and part of that I think is. Invention, goes beyond just memorizing information and pattern recognition, right? It requires like a spark of creative, innovation, ingenuity. There's something unique about that whole process. But I think that's something probably in the next year or two we might see AIs capable of doing that.
And Matthew, in terms of AI's participating in the creative act in that sense, creativity obviously is something that there are individuals of genius who have foresight, who are able to see things, make connections that we might not think or not be able to see yet. But obviously, sometimes that also requires a community, that requires human dialogue, and that ability of people to communicate at large levels and come up and work together on a common goal. A lot of the great inventions of society have been done that way. Do you see AI working together, or are AI systems able to communicate with one another to work on something? And in a weird way, you get a cluster of super AIs, solving problems, or are the current AI models, all individual based? You can one program, one problem.
No. They work. They're working together more and more, and I think that's obviously going to be enormously beneficial for us. I mean, these machines having memorized and crunched some of the best data from the brightest minds. They're great aids in invention, right, in the process. And so more and more, what we're starting to see, like there are limits to the current modalities for training right now. I mean, there's only so much you can do in pre-training, post-training, right? And now we have this new reinforcement learning paradigm, which is enormously helpful, right? I mean, where you basically give them, you set an environment for them to learn, and then they basically kind of unleash them in the environment in the same way kind of a baby learns when you unleash it in the house and let it crawl around, right? These AIs kind of learn through interacting with the environment, and that's incredible because that means that we don't have to like feed them a whole bunch of pairs, which in which case we become the bottleneck, as I said before. They're able to kind of learn just by interacting, right? And so this has allowed them to kind of take off, and we've seen this in like models like DeepSeek and stuff. They were one of the first to come out there and really demonstrate the power of reinforcement learning. And now, yes, these models are starting to work together in tandem. Now they have been for I would say like a year or two. We've had situations where you submit a prompt and you may have multiple models generate answers. Then you may have one kind of teacher model which will evaluate the answers and pick the best one, right? Yeah. So we have had this kind of orchestration happening in the past, but now we're starting to see that they're leveraging new techniques like tree search, Monte Carlo tree search, and which is basically, and this has been, if you remember that with Go, when AI beat the best Go player in the world, right? That was remarkable, and that move 37, if you recall, was one of the few examples of a truly original move that we have from an AI system, right? It posited a move that the human experts just couldn't understand why it did this, and so that was really cool. And one of the ways that AI was able to beat the best Go player in the world was leveraging this technique called tree search, where it plays itself millions of times, and what it does is it knows the board, so it knows the environment, it knows the rules, and it can like suggest moves to itself, right? Innumerable kind of moves and strategies, and then it kind of evaluates how they may play out, and then therefore it picks one of those particular strategies, so the next move, and so because it has this ability to kind of to propose all these different possibilities and then to kind of test them all, and then obviously one of those moves will ultimately contribute to a victory or contribute to a loss, and then it can feed that information back and say, how did that particular move help me or hurt me, and it can learn from that. This tree search is really going to be critically important, and so right now that's not, AIs haven't been able to leverage that, but there are, by merging these kind of tree search techniques, which allowed AlphaGo to beat the best Go player in the world. If we can combine that with generative AI models, I think that's going to be a massive unlock. And so part of this is if you have multiple models, you have multiple Grok 4s, which are all this tree search capability combined, and they're all doing search across. I mean, you put this all together and it becomes what they'll be able to do to advance science, I think, will be quite enormous. And I think that they will actually be able to explore areas of science and propose hypotheses that we haven't even conceived of, and they may come back with really interesting results. Demis Hassabis talks about kind of three different ways of understanding intelligence. You have interpolation, which would be an example, like in the case of AI, like a diffusion model is a good example, where you train a model on images of cats, right? And then you ask the model to generate a new image of a cat that doesn't exist, right? And so what it does is it kind of calculates, it kind of takes all that statistical data, all the images of the cats, and it produces one that is unique. So it's unique in the sense that cat, as you see, it does not appear in its training data, but it arrived at that cat via statistical, and another one would be extrapolation, and this would be how the AI and the AlphaGo arrived at that move 37, right, where it proposes different moves to itself, and it finds one particular that it thinks is worth applying, and it turns out that that's true, and so that would be an example of extrapolation, move 37. But invention, right, and innovation is something different. And so, these models, even working together in tandem, we haven't seen any real evidence that they're capable of truly original thought. At least I'm not aware of any that I think are really convincing, but I think that's something that might be possible in a year or so.
Wow. No, that's thrilling, but it's also, dissettling in a certain sense to think of these alien intelligences, starting to create and act. And Matthew, when you look ahead, let's say in the next year, but then also a little bit further along, maybe the next 5-10 years, and we see these AIs that have enormous capabilities, that have access to all of the data that humans have ever created, and they're able to innovate, think, reason at a speed that we can't even imagine. Some people start to get very nervous about that, and I think that's been categorized and shown in popular culture and films, and it's hard almost to see a popular film where there's a really great, wonderful robot that solves all our problems. It's often much more dystopian. When we look at culture, and then we look at these AIs who then will start to create and impose themselves in certain ways, much more on our life, a lot of people are really nervous. Where do you see this going, and how do you see society adapting? And there was a recent article that came out from Goldman Sachs, the great bank, and they said that in the next 10 years they anticipate more than 25% of jobs going away. And I know there's much more.
I think that's way too conservative. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true. I think it's much higher. I think if you think of the way the economic system works, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ben.
No. Please.
But I just, I find that those are not, those kind of like more conservative claims are not entirely helpful, because I think our problem right now is that AI is significantly underhyped in the long term. Sometimes it's overhyped in the short
Absolutely,
term.
Yeah.
But it's certainly underhyped in the long term. And I think saying things like AI and robots in the next 10 years are going to wipe out 20% of jobs is absurd. Mm-hmm. Because
you think it's because they're nervous, because they don't want people to be scared?
I think so. I think that they're, they want to rattle people, mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to say that they're dishonest. And I'm mm-hmm. sure that the data they have, that number they arrived at via, they had a particular approach, and they believe confidently that's the right number. I just think that that's incorrect, and it just kind of ignores certain kind of realities. I mean, about how the economic system works. I mean, if you think about, like, let's just take AI and robots, right? So you have your disembodied AIs mm-hmm. that live in large inference compute clusters. That and those jobs right now, we already can see those jobs are starting to replace coders,
Absolutely,
right? And now they're starting to come after white collar workers,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So
data analytics.
I mean, I think the law, the medicine fields, I think all these fields. And you think about with these more recent models that are coming out, their capability in regards to like diagnostics for medicine, right? Or their ability to predict market trends and things. I mean, they're next level. I mean, they're truly next level. So if I'm a company and I'm a for-profit company, and so what our shareholders want is us to make money, right? And I have this AI, this kind of super AI, which is capable of predicting market trends better than any 10, 20, 30 people combined. Well, and I'm in this competitive landscape where I have to be ahead of the curve. The idea that I'm going to choose not to use the AI because I have 30 employees who are not as capable, but I have some loyalty to them, and so I'm going to keep them I think that's just not realistic. And I think that they will feel immense pressure to let those 30 people go and choose the AI, because that will allow them to stay competitive. And you can see that playing out, that tension, in almost any field, especially office work, right? And then you start thinking about robots, which are basically embodied AIs, and you start thinking about blue collar work. So anything that is a highly repetitive task that doesn't require a lot of generalized learning. So let's say like a factory environment. Like robots can work, let's say 18 hours a day. They stop to charge, and that's basically. And now what we're finding is their ability to swap their own batteries out, which takes about 90 seconds to do, and then they're back on the line, right? So, and you think about this robot, you pay once, and you have maybe some very low maintenance costs, but for the most part, they're on the line, and they could work for 5 to 10 years, right? In principle, and then you think of a human employee and what you have to pay them. Every year you have to pay them, right? And there's benefits and other things. Just think about that again from a competitive point of view. These factories will not be able to compete unless they move towards greater and greater automation. So, and then you think about, you start looking at all the jobs that are currently out there, and if we think about the robots and the AIs, how many are likely to feel this competitive pressure? Almost all of them. Mm-hmm. Almost all of them. So to say 25% is absurd. The only thing I think that's slowing down this transition is because AI capabilities, they're still very narrow in their intelligence. They're not generalized, right? So they have difficulty moving from STEM, as we talked about, to other fields. But as we get closer and closer to artificial general intelligence, and their intelligence becomes more and more general, meaning they're having PhD capability in even more domains, you're going to start to see them move more and more to white collar work. And as the AIs start to get there's a big manufacturing challenge right now with robots, right? But as the AIs, more and more AIs get released into the world, and they start learning from interacting with the environment, again, like children, they're going to get better at navigating this environment. We're already seeing like Teslas and autopilot, right, capable of amazing things. And so really we just have this manufacturing bottleneck. The AI will be there in the next year or two. They'll be fairly generalized, I think, to be able to work in most environments. You're going to see those robots just flood the market. So, I mean, I think realistically in the horizon of 10 years, you could look at 80 and 90% of GDP economy jobs just being gone. It's not to say there won't be other jobs that are created, possibly, but I do think it's going to mean that we have to start thinking beyond just defining my value based upon how much I contribute to the GDP economy, right? And that has to be more to life than that, because I just don't think there's going to be a lot of opportunities in those areas, except for those who are like people that are uniquely capable of hybridizing with AI systems, right? It's not to say there won't be humans involved. There will be, but these people are going to be, the elite who are uniquely capable of working with machines, and that's going to be a very small percentage of the population.
And Matthew, hearing this, first off, I know maybe now people are starting to talk about this, but I don't hear in the general conversation online about AI, people looking at that future and being able to paint something that's really positive. Because I think a lot of people, if they hear 90% next 10 years, and I'm not, I'm not going to be able to contribute or compete. Obviously I can see a lot of people going into a very dark place. I can also see, political sentiment, social sentiment that goes against AI, that goes against this innovation or this continued development. Where do you see things going in terms of the social response to this, the political response? And then, of course, we're going to get to the church.
Right. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to how honest we are with people, and how serious. Like we acknowledge this challenge. I mean, so let me start with like the being honest with the people. So some of the heads of the AI labs, I think, are trying to be honest with people about the possibilities for the technology, which is super exciting, but also the challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very clear that this could kind of break in two different ways. That's how I see it anyway. One is we are honest with people, about where this technology is headed, and that stokes a very robust and honest civil conversation, and that civil conversation then informs the policies of our elected representatives, and they enact laws, regulations to ensure that this technological transition happens in a way that's likely not to impede human flourishing, right? So not necessarily slow down the technological development, but ensures that people's basic necessities are met and that people are comfortable that they'll have a meaning and purpose, right, in the future. So I think a lot of this is just making sure that the right information makes it to the people, so they can discuss what kind of future they want to build together, and ensure that their politicians are passing the right laws to help us arrive at that better future. Mm-hmm. And again, a lot of this is contingent upon how clearly I think our leaders can sell a vision of the future in which we're kind of working alongside AI and robots. I mean, I think that's a really critical part of this. I mean, as Cardinal Collins used to always say to me, if you know where you're going, you're more likely to get there. So I think we do need to collectively have a sense for how our world could be better, like what the right relationship of AI and robots is. In what areas should they be involved? In what areas shouldn't they be? And how can human beings be living in 20 years? How do we want to live? How do we want our kids to grow up? And I think if we can get clear about what kind of world we want to build, then we can work backwards. Yeah. And we can make sure we're passing the right laws in order to arrive there.
And Matthew, it seems at the moment that the political leadership, at least in the United States, is very concerned and very focused on, well, we are in a geopolitical and technological race with China. And it seems that the attention is on, we need to arrive at AGI as fast as possible, because of course this would allow whoever arrives there first will have enormous leverage on the rest of the world economy. And I think that speed and that I guess anxiety around getting there first, or the fear that's the other side, China will arrive there first, is making it so that there doesn't seem to be as much foresight on, okay, what happens when we arrive there, or how do we have this civil conversation? Because the general public, at least online when I'm paying attention, they don't feel that they didn't vote for, okay, my data is going to be used to train this AI, or I have all these concerns about AI in general, and no one is voting on this, or even able to cautiously put the brakes on certain things out of security measures.
Right. I mean, the first thing I probably just start by saying the race with China is real, and I think it's very serious. I think all of us who grew up in the West, appreciate our Western values and our Western way of life, and China in many ways has a different understanding of the way the world should kind of work. And so whatever country achieves artificial general intelligence first will be at an enormous advantage economically, militarily. And of course that, with AGI, once they have AGI, they can then replicate those AGIs, right? And those artificial general intelligence, I mean, that will be an enormous boon to them. And that will allow them as a country to get ahead, but also I think will increase their sphere of influence, right? Because they'll be able to generate a lot of prosperity at home and then in principle be able to share that prosperity with allies. And so I do understand the pressure. I mean, I do think, I do want the U.S., because principally they're the leader in AI right now, I do want them to win this race. But it's not something that, I don't think the average person, the average citizen has been really informed about what's going on here, what the stakes are, and feel like they have real agency in this. The decision to engage, China in this kind of new, Cold War has certainly been made by our leaders. I think it makes sense. That's why they're elected, right? To make these kind of calls, and the technology moving so quickly, it'd be difficult to have a referendum on it, right? I mean, that would take time. But I do think it does pose real risks. And I don't think certainly we cannot take for granted the West is going to win. I mean, there's a good chance that China will win this, at least initially. Now, hopefully we won't be too far behind and we can kind of, check each other. But I think there's a real chance that China could get ahead, and there's for all kinds of reasons. And so I think this is going to play out, and I don't think there's much we can do about it, right? I think, China and the U.S. are going to compete to get to AGI. So, trying to slow down the technology, I just don't think that's realistic. And so I think our time and energy is better spent focused on ensuring that we don't leave people behind. And I think if the church focuses more of its time and energy on that, and about helping humanity to reminding humanity about what life's supposed to be about and what civilization is supposed to be about, and making it clear what kind of future. Better future we should be paddling towards. I think that's a much better project than just lobbying to try to slow the technology down to allow time for people to adapt. I just don't think it's realistic.
And then Matthew, before we get to the church's role with helping steward and guide the ship as we approach AGI, could you please unpack what AGI, artificial general intelligence, is, what it in theory will look like, and then of course it's just a stone's throw away from ASI, artificial superintelligence? Sure.
Yeah, I guess we've been dropping that term quite a few times. So I mean, artificial general intelligence. Well, let me put it this way: that today, what we're interacting with for the most part is artificial narrow intelligence, right? So basically, it means that an AI system has been trained on a specific domain and is excellent within that respective domain. So it has a high level of intelligence in a specific domain. But if you were to then move that particular AI to another domain, right, its intelligence is very brittle. It would start to fall apart. It's not able to kind of generalize what it's learned in this one domain and apply it that well in another. Now, this is certainly the case on more classical AI systems. I mean, they were very, very narrow. I mean, now with generative AI, we're finding that actually the AIs are getting better and better at generalizing what they know on, let's say, STEM and applying it to even something like, as we talked about earlier, philosophy or theology. But that being said, right now what we're really seeing is AIs excel within STEM and coding, right? And they're not as good in the humanities. In artificial general intelligence, as the name implies, wouldn't have that constraint. So in principle, it would be capable of computing essentially anything that's computable. And so you think of it like this. I mean, one of the founder of classical computing, I mean, is Alan Turing, and he had this thing called, his understanding is called the Turing machine, right? And in principle, for him, a human brain is kind of like a Turing machine, right? The human brain is uniquely capable of really crunching and processing, and analyzing really anything that can be crunched and analyzed and processed. And so I think Turing would probably say that an artificial general intelligence should be in principle capable of which the human brain can do. And so now there's different ways of defining AGI, but that's the way that I understand it. And that's the way someone like Demis Hassabis from DeepMind and others would define it. So an artificial general intelligence to me would be an AI which is capable of let's just say PhD level capability in multiple domains and beyond a particular like STEM. And I think if we saw an AI demonstrate that level of capability, I think we would have effectively hit AGI.
And an AGI would, for all intents and purposes, supersede an average person in almost any field. I mean, it would.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people argue that. I mean, I think. As far as I'm concerned, if an AI was able to demonstrate, I mean, there's a number of different ways of testing for like general intelligence. There's one called the ARC challenge, right? And like generalized intelligence or fluid intelligence is actually it's a very specific. It's very specific and it's very very hard. and like Jan LeCun who's the head of Meta AI's division, talks a lot about this. I mean, the amount of data that babies crunch, right, in order to build that world model, which allows them to effectively operate in the world, is immense. I mean, I mean, the models that we train today, the large language models, are trained on basically all the text data we have on the internet, which is like 20 trillion tokens now. It's always growing, but and that allows them to be pretty masterfully understand language, right? And they've been able to leverage that understanding, and then when they have access to other forms of data, like in chemistry, biology, and chemistry and math and stuff, they're able to. But for the most part, despite all of that data, which seems like a lot, they still suck at like general intelligence tasks, right? I mean, which is kind of surprising, right? Until you understand how much data a baby's brain is processing, right, in its first few years, right? I mean, like, so for instance, I said 20 trillion tokens, right?
Yeah.
So that data, like if you were to add up all that data, a baby has crunched more data than that simply through vision. So that one sensory modality by the time they're 4 years old.
Wow.
And that's just one sensory modality, right? So you think about, like, in order for a baby to operate in the world, right, at baby levels, it has to crunch mass amounts of data in multiple modalities to build an effective world model. So we shouldn't be surprised when an AI, when we give it all access to language, which is discrete, right? Because language only expresses understanding at a very kind of high level of abstraction. So we shouldn't be surprised when we put an AI in a robot and it's banging around in things, right? I mean, of course, right? And so building effective world models is absolutely key to general intelligence, as far as I'm concerned. We talk now about the age of experience for AIs, and this is where I talked about it earlier, where what you want to do is in some ways allow the AI to embody the AI, allow it to interact with the environment and learn like a child does, right? So you give it the sensor modalities, similar sensor modalities, and just let it interact and learn from first principles, right? That's a better way to train a model because it's less dependent on human data, which is not always high quality, right? Or may not actually reflect the ground truth. So AGI is going to require a number of technical breakthroughs to get there. I think a lot of the labs feel they know what those are. I guess we'll see if they're right. And I think maybe somewhere between 2 to 5 years, we'll probably achieve artificial general intelligence. And then once we've achieved artificial general intelligence, we can then work with that artificial general intelligence to help us achieve artificial superintelligence. Again, artificial and superintelligence is kind of it's difficult to find. It depends who you ask. I tend to think of artificial superintelligence as an artificial intelligence which, in principle, its computational capability exceeds that of the entire human race.
Wow.
So, and you can imagine the effect that would have on the world if that were to exist. So, and again, I don't think we effectively know how to build that yet. But AGI, working with AGI, we probably could figure it out. And the thought is that if we have AGIs, we could build a whole fleet of those things, and that would allow us to make rapid progress towards artificial superintelligence. And so you can see why, like, getting to AGI for China and for the US is such a big deal, right? Because it's thought that whoever gets AGI first, it may not be able to possibly catch them, right? They just may run away and all the way up to artificial superintelligence.
Yeah. And the acceleration that would happen with AGIs working together, I find that there would be a telescoping in terms of time, that certain progress that seemed impossible within months or years would arrive. And so then, Matthew, looking at all that and the enormous transformations that are on our horizon, what role does the church have in being in dialogue with this and in stewarding the faithful, who I'm sure I know actually that have all sorts of questions, anxieties, and concerns, and already we're coming from a society that already has a lot of things to work on to improve. There is economic distress. There's social tensions for all different reasons. I feel like you put AI in there and you remove jobs which give a lot of people purpose.
Yes, but I think it's important to acknowledge what is one of the primary motivators. Like, why are some of the smartest people in the world working so hard on AI, right? And not like, curing cancer, right? Or giving us the flying cars that we're all supposed to have, right? That the Jetsons promised me, right? That never materialized. Because they think that AI will help us crack these problems. And I think they're right. I totally think they're right. I mean, look at Demis Hassabis and DeepMind with protein folding, right?
Extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. So without a doubt, as AIs get smarter, they're going to be able to help us crack a lot of these problems. And so things like disease and stuff, we may actually be able to crack that. I mean, it does feel like that is inevitable at this point if the technology continues to progress. I think poverty is another one, right? I mean, how do we solve poverty? I think a lot of people feel that AI will help us get there. AI and robots, I mean, they're going to be able to produce goods and services. I mean, for prices like we never like conceived of before. So there is a real likelihood that it'll create a rising tide and it'll lift potentially billions out of poverty. So that's exciting, right? And that's I mean, you think about if we just address everybody's Maslow needs, like ensuring they have shelter, they have food, that their kids are going to be well educated and they'll have opportunities ahead of them. If you take away those pressures from people, I think that could even help us address things like war and conflict. I mean, I'm no expert in these things, but generally I would say a lot of conflicts are driven by scarcity. Absolutely. And the ability, as people manipulate others and tell them, if we don't do this, your kids are going to starve, and we have to do this. And so if AI and robots allows everyone to have a fairly decent standard of living, and we take away those Maslow needs, I think it becomes harder to justify, violence, right? So I do think that the hype around this technology in that way is very real, and I'm very optimistic. That being said, there is this, as we talked about before, the existential cliff that I do worry about a lot, right? I mean, and again, we've seen it in movies and television, right? I mean, let's say you make kind of a better world in the sense that people aren't, dying of disease anymore, and everyone's got a home, and their kids are able to learn, and so that all sounds great. But then there is this whole issue of purpose, right, in meaning. And so then what do I do with this time that I have now been gifted, right? And that's I think remains a big problem, as it always been. Without the proper human intellectual and spiritual formation, as we say in the church, I don't know if we'll know how to constructively use that time, and we could end up chasing dopamine hits right off of a cliff. And that is something that really concerns me. And this is why I feel so strongly that we must succeed at the new evangelization. I think all of us have to really now focus as much in time and energy as we can in ensuring that we're preaching the gospel, and we're taking advantage of every opportunity we can to share the gospel with others, which is why I'm so passionate about Catholic AI.
Yeah. And so, Matthew, you said the magic word there, Catholic AI. What is Catholic AI? Where can the church insert itself into this conversation and into these these new machines, these new ways of communicating and discovering information?
Well, I mean, Catholic AI. I mean, I don't know if there's an official definition. I mean, I think we're kind of pioneering in this space. We're kind of figuring out as we go along. But the way I understand Catholic AI is essentially it's the desire to create artificial intelligence that are aligned with, let's say, the magisterium of the Catholic Church. So in a technical terms, we could say that the objective function of Catholic AI is fidelity. So that's a Catholic AI system. So an AI system which tries as faithfully as possible to reproduce and be faithful to that which the Church teaches. That's it. That's Catholic AI. And so then that's different from like secular AI, right? Like from what Gemini and Claude and ChatGPT are, because their objective function is not fidelity. I mean, their objective functions, I don't even know what their objective functions are. I mean, obviously increased capabilities is their objective function. Get to AGI seems to be the kind of the objective function, but it's not fidelity. So it's not to say that they can't effectively reproduce or pair it with the Church teaches, right? But suffice it to say, not as well as an AI, which is totally built to ensure that it's faithful, right? So that's why I think there's a place for Catholic AI. And I think it's needed. It's absolutely needed. It's the reason why we even got into this in the first place is because we knew people were using ChatGPT. They're asking philosophical, theological, moral questions. And like I said, ChatGPT may knock it out of the park 8, 9 times out of 10. But how comfortable are you with that 1 or 2 times out of 10? It totally hallucinates something and leads someone astray. I'm not cool with that, right? And so the question is, can we get it, to have a better batting average than that? And I think we've demonstrated that yes we can, but it takes a lot of focused attention. And so that's kind of the Catholic AI project.
And Matthew, how do you ensure fidelity?
Well, it's not easy. And when we started Magisterium AI, basically as a research project, that was kind of the question. How can we take state-of-the-art models, or SOTA models as we call them, and can we teach them to be faithful? And long story short, you can, but it's not perfect, and that part of that is because it's just the nature of generative AI. It's non-deterministic, right? I mean, for those of you who don't know it, like non-determinism, generative AI models, basically what it means is when you prompt an AI, we can't be certain what it's going to say. We can try and ensure that the outcome is desirable as possible or as aligned as possible, but it's never 100% certain. And that, of course, determinism would be the opposite of that, right? Where and more classical AI systems are kind of capable of this, right? Where you give it a prompt and you actually can make sure that the answer is exactly what you predicted. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, like leveraging generative AI models is a challenge, right? Because we're not looking for kind of creativity in doctrine and dogma. We don't want it to interpret it in unique and novel ways. We want it to be faithful. We want it, but we found through a number of techniques that you can significantly reduce the probability of hallucination. And so there's a number of different ways we've effectively been able to do this. One is ensuring that everything that the AI says is grounded in a source. And so this is something we call retrieval augmented generation. Mm-hmm. And so in essence, what you do and what we've had to do is basically get everything the church has ever said and that's been digitized and put it together in our knowledge base. Right now, I think our knowledge base is just over 27,000 Catholic theological and philosophical texts. And that includes all the compendiums and, all the council documents, documents like the Euryticon and other important sources, the teachings of the doctors of the church. And so that's a fairly broad distribution of not broad enough, but it's certainly. And then essentially, when someone asks a question, kind of one AI system goes in and checks to see what documents are relevant to answering that question. So we call that a retriever, and it goes and retrieves all the relevant chunks, parts of the document which are relevant to answering that question, and retrieves them. And then basically it passes those on to an AI, which is then responsible for like distilling them. So and providing an answer. But everything it says has to be grounded in one of those documents. And then the idea is to have as much transparency there as possible. So when the AI does generate its answer, it provides inline citations. So the user can check and see, why did you say that? They can go and check the original source to make sure it's true. This is not something effectively that secular AI systems do. They're starting to introduce, research mode, right, where they go and check websites or reverse RAG. Well, they'll generate an answer and they'll find documents to validate what they're saying. But again, there's always a question of what sources are you using? How do I know those are the right sources? And this can be like tedious because you have to then check and make sure that the sources it checked on the web, how faithful are they? How much do I trust those? Whereas our knowledge base is really just official church teaching and what would be considered to be the most authoritative Catholic theological and philosophical texts. And so in that sense, you don't have to check the sources. So RAG is one approach, retrieval augmented generation.
And Matthew, how do you select the sources? I imagine, with the Catholic data set or with Catholic knowledge and that's been created over 2,000 years, I imagine there's Catholic theologians who have talked about almost every subject. How do you and the team select and then also prioritize in terms of hierarchy of, this is from a pope or this is from a church father?
Well, they definitely haven't talked about every subject because we become painfully aware of that. They certainly have covered a lot of moral ground, philosophical, theological ground. The big challenge, of course, is kind of the everyday, day-to-day people's experiences, right? I mean, when they go and start asking questions about that, it's difficult because obviously they weren't writing for a particular person's experience necessarily. So that's a challenge, but that's a rabbit hole we can get into if you want. But how do we go about selecting sources? Well, I mean, it's actually it's not really rocket science. So, I mean, we do have a scholarly advisory board, which is chaired by some notable heads of pontifical universities and things like that. And so, when we started having this conversation about where should we start, they said we start with fundamental magisterial teaching, right? So start with the fundamental dogmas and doctrines of the church. So the catechisms, the council documents and things, and essentially, once we had that. We're still getting that together, and we have all the contemporary stuff. We're still going back and trying to get our hands on all the ancient stuff. Then it's just a question of going from the extraordinary magisterium. How much of the ordinary magisterium do we embrace, right? So that would be like the reflections of the bishops and the popes and things. And so the simple answer is we try and start with we try and grab the most authoritative stuff, right? So that's where we started. And then slowly but surely we've been expanding that out to include the doctors of the church, the church fathers. And then even some bishops' conferences, magisterial teaching, the homilies of the popes, general audiences. We've been focusing a lot on that lately, namely because those general audiences and homilies are incredible examples of basically human beings' ability to distill from like very complicated theological texts, and this Pope in 15 minutes distills it down for people to understand, right? While at the same time reflecting on why it's relevant to the world. These kind of examples of distillation for AI are really important because people come and they'll bring like a very generalized situation. Here's what's going on in my life. What would the church say to me? And this was a big problem when we started. It freaked us out. I mean, at one point I was wondering if we should even be doing this. And then the only reason we continued, namely, because I didn't think, especially with the early AIs, which weren't that intelligent, I wasn't sure if we should, was I realized if we stop, people are just going to take those questions to ChatGPT. And I mean, at least for us, we're trying. Our objective function is fidelity, right? So I thought, well, we got to stay at this, right? Because it's better than just going back to secular AIs. But this issue of someone sharing a particular situation, being able to ensure that the AI is then able to understand from first principles what the church teaches and then apply it to that particular situation. The best way, like we found to enable, well, I should say the way that we found that was most effective to allow the AI to do that was just by showing innumerable examples of the popes and other notable people in the church doing it. And then the AI was able to kind of figure it out.
And then Matthew, the fact that you and the team have ingested, have digitized all this incredible body of work. This is something that's unique that only Magisterium AI has, because I think of users who may be watching who have questions and they might go to a ChatGPT or a Gemini and maybe in some cases they provide the right answer, but often, a lot of times, and this happened to me specifically, we get hallucinations, where all of a sudden the AI is generating an answer that is not grounded in a text or in tradition or in anything based on fidelity. Could you speak on hallucinations and what that is and why that takes place?
Well, first, let me just say, just to define what it is. So hallucination essentially is when an AI makes something up. And it's coming, I think it's sort of coming from a good place. I mean, it's very eager to please. It wants to give you an answer, right? And sometimes it maybe wasn't trained on the data it needs to answer, and so it just kind of makes it up, right? So it's not grounded in anything, and so this is particularly a problem when we're dealing in the realm of facts, where when it hallucinates a fact, so it passes something off as a fact, but in fact it's not actually a fact. It's not true. So this is a hallucination, and obviously they've been a problem in generative AI from the very beginning. Now AI systems, as they got better, the likelihood of hallucinations is going down over time. And if you combine it with other techniques like RAG and prompt engineering and tooling, you can bring that probability down. And that's what we've been able to effectively demonstrate with Magisterium AI. But hallucinations, I think, at least for the foreseeable future, will remain a problem as long as we're using generative AI. It's just one of the. I mean, again, like the way generative AI models, it's calculating probabilities and it's doing next token prediction, right? And sometimes those statistical predictions are wrong. So, and if you compound like next token prediction, one token after another, it tends to be like we call it like exponential drift. Like the longer it talks, the probability that it'll just kind of go off. These statistical errors can compound and it can just go off in some weird tangent, which is why this is a very difficult problem to solve. But I think we're getting closer to cracking it.
And Matthew, when you look at the major LLM, the leading language models, how do you score them? Where do they run in terms of fidelity? Do you?
Well, so in order to score them, so to speak, you have to have what we call in the industry evals, which is basically like question answer pairs, where you have like a question and then you have like the right answer, and you need to compile a lot of those. And so that's something we've been working really hard on, is to kind of build the most comprehensive eval set for fidelity. Because essentially this is just because we need to do this in order to effectively make Matterstream AI work. We use state-of-the-art models under the hood. And namely because these state-of-the-art models, generally every new model that ships is just better at reasoning. I say that in quotation marks. It's just smarter, and therefore it's also better at instruct following. So it follows our instructions more faithfully. And this is obviously critically important. Like don't make something up if you don't have a source. Like don't hallucinate. So we always want our Matterstream AI users to be able to take advantage of the most cutting edge models, and that way they don't have. It's not a trade off. Like if they want the smartest models, they don't have to abandon Matterstream AI and go to like ChatGPT, because those models tend to be used under the hood. We just have a whole bunch of knowledge and orchestration on top of that to make the model even better at being faithful, right? So anyway, this is a long way of saying it's a complicated process, but it's. But I think it's essential that whenever we're using, when the church is building Catholic AI, that we don't want to have like a ghettoized approach where we feel that in order to have a Catholic AI, it means that we have to do it from scratch ourselves, right? Because essentially what it means is we won't have as good AI, and then users will feel compelled to go use secular AIs. I mean, so this is not to say that the project of training a Catholic language model is not worth it. I mean, it is. We have effectively trained the world's first Catholic language model called Ephraim. We're now on version 2 of Ephraim, and that project was enormously helpful to us. And I think it holds a lot of promise. And it could be in 6 to 8 months we'll release that model to the world for people to test. Amazing. And I think it'll be impressive. So I think that trying to train a Catholic model is a worthy endeavor, but for the foreseeable future, given the pace of AI, it just makes sense to try and be AI complete. Right, which is effectively a way of saying building a system which allows you to leverage frontier, state-of-the-art capabilities within your system, and so your AI is as intelligent as it possibly can be.
And Matthew, what is the hardest part of working on this problem of building and scaling Catholic AI?
Well, I think the hardest part is just dealing with the fact that this is about people's souls, right? And so it's a terrible responsibility. One that again, like I never truly appreciated when we started this project. It was more of a kind of curiosity to us. I never thought we'd be going this deep into it. It would scale so quickly. So we take that responsibility very seriously, which is why we really value the relationships we have with the church. More formally. As I mentioned, we have a scholarly advisory board, which has been enormously helpful. We've worked in collaborations, basically since the very beginning with pontifical universities, notably the Pontifical Oriental Institute and now the Pontifical Gregorian University in this project. And again, without their help, I don't think I would have had the confidence to proceed in this. So I would say that I think generally is the hardest thing, is just ensuring that we're always, especially when we're testing a new model that we want to use, making sure we're effectively evaluating that model faithfully to understand the way the models are weak and the way the models are strong, and then really making sure that we can mitigate the weaknesses before deploying the model to ensure we don't lead anyone astray. So that's one of the hardest problems. Is the other I think the hard problem is just recognizing that there are AIs out there which are very useful and are great and people appreciate, and there are AIs out there that are not great and are leading people astray. I mean, there are AIs which are helping facilitate human flourishing, and there are AIs which are actively, I think, in some ways impeding, flourishing. I mean, one example, not to pick on them because it's not entirely fair, but like character AI. We've all probably heard stories of people that, they becoming their friends and they fall in love with their character AI, and that's obviously not good. And so those AIs tend to give a kind of a bad name to the technology in general, and so that becomes something that we have to respond to. So I think one of the challenges is just effectively educating people about what is the technology, what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses, what are the risks, what are the possible rewards, and just ensuring people understand it so that way they leverage the tool effectively and in as responsible way as possible.
And Matthew, I know you've been traveling a lot. You've been visiting different bishops' conferences, speaking with the laity, with the clergy. What have you learned when speaking to them about their concerns or where they're at in terms of adoption? And also, what are the things that you've brought back in terms of informing the work, the research that the team is doing?
Well, I mean, one thing that's given me a lot of hope is initially, and I think I've said this before, but when I initially went to visit the bishops' conferences to talk about basically the trajectory of AI, but specifically what we're doing in Catholic AI, I was nervous. Like I kind of felt like the technology was very new and there was a lot of controversy around it, and I wasn't sure how it'd be regarded. But for the most part, I've been very like pleasantly surprised. I think it's really, for the most part, I think that there's a recognition now amongst the bishops that this technology is not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it is a very powerful tool. It's too powerful for the church to ignore. Kind of like the printing press, right? I mean, it would be absurd. I mean, think of how far we've come with the printing press. Not to say that it wasn't disruptive and caused some issues as well, but certainly we're all glad that the church embraced the printing press. And I think in the same way, we're kind of at the same point. It's AI can be used for good, can be used for bad, but it's still primarily a tool. Maybe not a neutral tool as long as it's relying heavily on human data. And Pope Francis is opined on this, but it is still a tool that can, if wielded effectively, can be incredible for advancing things like evangelization. So I think right now there's just a lot of confusion about what the technology is, how it's going to affect society, and what is the role for the church in effectively leveraging this technology. And I found for the most part it's just been, especially amongst the bishops, it's just been curiosity. They want to better understand the technology, and so that they can, obviously pastorally respond. And I think that's kind of where we're at now, is a recognition we have to use the technology. Now, how do we provide the right pastoral direction and instruction to our priests and to the laity?
And Matthew, of course, the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Leo XIV, famously took, he's referenced this, he took his name in honor and in reflection of the work of Pope Leo XIII, who, of course, shepherded the church, shepherded the faithful through another, transition, a revolution, the industrial one. We're obviously in an AI revolution. What are your hopes for his papacy? And also, if you had the opportunity to advise or speak with him, where would you want him to turn his attention in terms of shepherding the people of God? Well,
thank God he's got a lot smarter people advising him than me. So I expect he's getting very good advice and therefore won't have to rely on mine. But naturally, I do have some feelings on this. I mean, and I think I've talked about it a little bit. I've kind of hinted at it earlier, perhaps. But I think there'll be some people around him who will want the Pope to use his office to try and encourage companies to companies and countries to slow down the technology, to give people time to adapt, and to ensure that we have effective regulation in place and that we can come up with the right ethical frameworks. And I certainly would understand why they'd advise that, but my insight would be we tried that and if it's failed, and I don't think that the Pope is going to make much of a difference here. And like I said, in large part because of this kind of China-U.S. This Cold War that's here. Neither side feels they can effectively afford to lose. So I think investing a lot of time and energy in that is not very helpful. So that being said, I think it's very important for the church to have an official position on how the technology is used in innumerable domains, right? And to be very clear that the technology being developed should always be focused on accelerating human flourishing, not impeding it, right? So so that doesn't mean necessarily that the technology being further developed means that nobody can lose their jobs, right? But effectively, it means that if people are going to have to transition out of their jobs to make room for this technology, those people should be taken care of and have a place to go, and they should feel that there's still work for them to do and that they matter. So I think that's very, very important, and I think so that obviously should be a very important focus of the Pope, and of course it will be. But the area that I think is, like I said before, is most important for the Pope, I think, to focus on. And I think we're very fortunate. I mean, I think it's providential that we have an Augustinian Pope. It's just helping humanity to get clear about what this whole civilization project is supposed to be about. Like, how do we build the city of God, right, on earth? And what should the city of God look like, feel like? What would it be like to experience a day in the life of people living in the city of God? It's really important that we get clear about that. I can't express that enough. And I think in the past there have been shows. I know the show's not perfect, but Star Trek: Next Generation is a good example, right? Where it showed a vision of humanity where we'd beaten poverty, right? We'd overcome racism and greed, and humanity was now focused on exploring the stars. And apparently, as they say in the show, Earth was kind of like paradise, right? And that was very hopeful. It's a hopeful sign that we can do this. right? And so it showed some kind of vision of the future. And then in principle, I know that inspired people like Trekkies, right? To say like, that's it. I want to be part of that human project. And so I'm going to dedicate my life to trying to emulate the values that they live by. And I want to try and build that kind of world. Well, I kind of think we need that now. Like we need to have that kind of concrete vision of the future. And for no other reason, I would say we won't be able to effectively regulate the technology unless we have a clear sense for how we want the technology to be developed and what problems we should be pointing it at. I mean, like when you're regulating, you're saying, the technology should be used in this way, but it shouldn't be used in that way, effectively. Well, then how do we make that prudential determination? That's based on some understanding of what the human person's about, what civilization's about, right? And so we have to have some sense of, ideally, what people should be doing with their time and energies, and how civilization should be built in order to help facilitate human flourishing. And I think we're not clear about that at all. So I think there's a real chance of a bunch of different interests getting involved. Have very specific ideas about how the technology be developed. And I'm not saying that those ideas are always going to be bad, but they may not always be consistent. And so I think that the Pope just needs to remind us of what human life is supposed to be about, what civilization is supposed to be all about, and what we, as I said before, should be paddling towards. And I think if he can effectively do that, that would be enormously beneficial, not just for the church, but actually for the AI industry itself. I mean, even the heads of the AI labs. I mean, this is something that they have kids, like many of those founders, so they're worried about the future, and they want to ensure the technology is directed in the right places, and they want effective regulation, ensure that it's developed, well, and to ensure that the transition to the new AI and robotics age is done peacefully and doesn't leave people behind. But that requires vision, and I think that's one thing that we seriously lack nowadays.
And Matthew, a final question here is the goal. Our goal should be to become saints. That's the goal of every Catholic. How would the saints use AI? I mean, it has the potential. You mentioned this, the new evangelization. It has the potential to change the way we operate, the way we think. Potentially, we'll have a lot more time on our hands. Of course, the internet has allowed us to communicate with everyone in the world. How do you see in our tradition of the great saints? How would they utilize this moment in time?
Well, I mean, I think back to when I was a seminarian, and I remember, I would just come out of the army, and here I was studying philosophy and theology, right? And I did not feel ready for this, or even really capable in some ways. And I remember walking into the library at our seminary and just looking at all the books, being like, oh man, what have I got myself into here, right? And it was not easy, right? Mm-hmm. If I had a question that I wanted answered, sometimes you could talk to a librarian. They could point you to a few books, and then you'd go to this card indexes, and you talk to your professors and get some suggestions, and you try and find books that make sense. And then you go to the books, you pull the books out of the stacks. I know this is for the younger generation. This must seem crazy. You pull the book out, and you have to kind of skim through the book to see if it speaks to the particular area that you're doing research into. It was tedious and took forever. I mean, it took a long time. And I think today, like with Matthew Harvey, effectively what's happening here, it's like the analogy I like to use. It's like walking into that library and shouting out your question to the library, and then all of a sudden the books just start popping off the shelves, right? And they're like, they float over to you, and they just open right to the exact page with the answer that you're looking for, just like that, right? I mean, that's kind of what AI is. It allows us to take everything that the saints have said, everything the church has said, and allow the insights which are most important to us, most valuable to us, and allow those to be brought forward and be made useful, like to me, to be able to apply them to my life. And if I think of like for the saints, right, if they had this technology, I think they would have been over the moon. I think it would have been for Thomas Aquinas. I think his mind would have just blown, right? I mean, what an opportunity! Never before in the history of humanity has any person really anywhere in the world, anyone who has access to the internet, can effectively, like through Matthew Harvey right now, access at least the entire body of the official, all of church teaching, and all they have to do is ask, and that the church teaching which is relevant will be distilled down for them and made applicable. This is incredible. This is absolutely incredible. And this is why I think it's probably the greatest unlock for the new evangelization that we've ever experienced. And we're already seeing that on the platform. People come sometimes. We know they're not Catholic, and they're hitting the AI, with what the world's told them the church believes, and then they get into this dialogue with the AI, and then they slowly start to understand that some of those ideas were not right, right? And then they basically just they jump in the rabbit hole, right? And next thing you know, they've been intellectually converted, right? They're kind of ready to take that next step in their faith journey. I mean, this is incredible. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's working with, tens of thousands of people around the world to answer their questions. And people are making these journeys effectively without even, in some cases, talking to a Catholic, which is a problem. And somebody that's not sufficient. It's not an end of itself. Obviously, it's critically important that we learn how to effectively off-ramp people so that they can engage the church communities. They can find a good parish. They can find a good priest. And but I think for recognizing that we do have a priest shortage and there's not enough lay Catholic ministers out there, and that people are on the internet browsing around. I mean, I think it's incredible to me that they now have a place they can go to dialogue with basically what all the saints I've said. That's incredible. So I'm very bullish on the technology, and I think it's certainly the greatest unlock for the new evangelization, which is why we have to really double down on this technology and ensure that we're building it in such a way that it can truly meet people where they're at.
Well, Matthew, this has been incredibly inspiring, and we look forward to maximizing and using Magisterium AI for that great evangelization that is ahead of us.
Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.